I think it's a really great melding of what you're doing in your book. I want to also take a moment to welcome some board members who are here. Thank you to Sasha and to our board chair, Ariel, to Wade, and to our friends at YCT, to Rev Asher. Thank you so much for being here, and it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces from around town, and we're so thrilled to be able to learn together with you. And without further ado, I really wanted to have Rella Feldman, who is Ilana's mother-in-law, among other things, to set us off on our journey together. And Rella has been somebody who's been on a journey with Maharat over the past several years, and as well as has been on a journey with Ilana. And I thought those two stories and narratives could be tied together best by Rella. So please, thank you so much for joining us and kicking our afternoon off again.
Thank you, Rabbi Sarah. It is such a personal pleasure for me to be here today among students, faculty, the community, Torah students, Rabbi Sarah Horowitz, Rabbi Fox, Rabbi Sarah Catton, and it is really a pleasure to be cast in the role of introducing my very accomplished and brilliant daughter-in-law, Ilana Kurshan, here today to speak to you about her acclaimed book, If All the Seas Were Ink. Ilana is in the U.S. from her home in Jerusalem for a 12-day intensely scheduled and very packed book tour. In 1923, when Rabbi Shapiro proposed his far-reaching idea of Dafyomi, this was a creative, revolutionary idea to connect Jews around the world into a vast learning community. And in 2009, actually the year that Ilana and Dan were married, when Rabbi Sarah Horowitz founded Yeshivat Maharat to train and educate women to assume clergy positions in the Orthodox community, that was revolutionary and far-reaching. Dafyomi has succeeded beyond its founder's conception, and Yeshivat Maharat is trailblazing the way for including women as clergy to teach, to guide, to console, to provide religious and spiritual inspiration to their communities. Women's voices added as leaders in the Jewish community. How appropriate that we are about to hear from Ilana, who in her very original book contributes her voice to decades of those learning Dafyomi and to centuries of rabbinic insights and commentaries. Ilana's book is making a huge impact, and she is too modest to see how very original it is. Ilana has accomplished what many have previously strived to do, personally intertwining her everyday life with her learning so that her life informs on the learning and her learning informs on her life. I've been told by readers that every high school student should read Ilana's book to appreciate the vibrancy of the learning and the connections to life. Ilana is contributing her unique woman's voice to the vast community of Dafyomi learners, just as you all here contribute yours to the tradition of those serving as rabbis in the Jewish world. Dafyomi has expanded to include women learning the Daf, as the rabbinate must expand to include women. And now, please welcome Ilana as she discusses her memoir set in the context of learning Dafyomi.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and a special honor to be introduced as I was, so thank you very much. I'm going to start with a story. Every day, on our way home from school, my kids and I pass a kiosk where they sell ice cream. Outside, there's a wrought iron gate where an old man whose arm is always covered in bandages sits in front on a low stool, smiling at passersby and waiting for customers. Each afternoon, my kids ask me, can we get ice cream today? And my response is always the same. On Friday. If you behave nicely all week, then
I want to hear what
get
she's saying.
on Friday. I want them to learn to delay gratification, and I want them to emulate Shammai, who we are told would save anything special to them during the week to enjoy at Shabbat. It's not easy for my kids because they're all under 6 years old and they want ice cream now. But we do stop every Friday, or at least we did until very recently. Last Friday, for the first time, I refused to get them the treat they've been anticipating all week. I was at my wit's end. My son and daughter were fighting over a scooter the entire way home. My toddler refused to sit in her stroller or hold my hand while we crossed the busy street. And my other daughter was screaming, "I want ice cream now," the entire way home. I was annoyed at their behavior and in no mood to indulge them. And so when we passed by the kiosk, I held my ground and insisted that we walk on. Later that afternoon, long after the inevitable tantrum had subsided and I was setting up the candles for Shabbat, my daughter Liav came over to me, prepared to have a rational conversation. "But Ima, you promised us ice cream. That's not fair. You can't promise and then change your mind." She was right, but not exactly. I told her a story I learned in Daf Yomi that week on Sanhedrin 98. Very recent, as some of you know, about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who once stumbled upon Elijah at the entrance to a cave. "When is the Mashiach coming?" Ben Levi asked, seizing the opportunity to ask a question that was always on everyone's mind. Elijah shrugged. "Why don't you go ask him yourself?" he suggested. "Where can I find him?" Ben Levi asked. "Look for him at the gates of Rome," Elijah instructed. Ben Levi was surprised. Rome was just a few days' journey away. "How will I recognize him when I get there?" said Elijah, already packing up his bags for the journey. Elijah explained that the Mashiach would be sitting among the afflicted, all of whom would be wrapping and unwrapping their bandages. Only the Mashiach would take off one bandage at a time, conscious that at any moment it might be time for him to come. Ben Levi set off for the gates of Rome, where sure enough he found the Mashiach dressing his wounds one at a time. "Greetings, Ben Levi," the Mashiach said to him. "When are you coming?" asked Ben Levi, getting right to the point. "Now," said the Mashiach. Ben Levi could hardly contain his excitement. He rushed back to share the good news with Elijah. By the time he arrived back at the cave, several days had elapsed. And alas, the Mashiach had not come. "He lied to me," Ben Levi complained to Elijah. "He promised he would come today, but he didn't come." Elijah smiled at Ben Levi like a patient father prepared to explain it all again more slowly this time. "Ah," Elijah sighed, "you didn't listen. He said, 'Today, if you heed him.'" This statement, "Today, if you heed him," is a quote from Tehillim, actually from one of the Psalms we recite every week in Kabbalat Shabbat. "Ki hu Elokeinu va'anachnu am marito v'tzon yado, hayom im b'kolo tishma'u." For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if you heed him. I explained to Liav that just as the Mashiach would come today, only if the people listened to God, so too would the kids have gotten ice cream today only if they behaved. If they bickered with one another the whole way home, then they would just have to keep waiting and waiting for the messianic ice cream to come. Now, I share this anecdote in part because the Daf Yomi community just finished Masechet Sanhedrin on Monday, and indeed Eliyahu plays another important role on the last Daf of Sanhedrin, but also because this is a very recent example of how the Talmud page I studied every day has informed so much of my daily experience and how my daily experience deepened my understanding of the text. When I first started learning Daf Yomi about 10 years ago, it was not because I imagined that the Talmud would speak to me so personally, and not even because I had any particular interest in studying Talmud. At the time, I was going through a hard period in my life. I was getting divorced after a brief marriage. I was living alone in Jerusalem, thousands of miles from my family and closest friends, and I was very depressed. I remember thinking that time stretched ahead of me inexorably, and that with every passing day, I was just going to get one day older. The only thing that got me out of bed in the mornings was that I had a friend I used to go jogging with in the mornings, and one day she mentioned to me that she'd begun learning Daf Yomi, and she suggested that I try it too. I looked at her like she was crazy. I'd heard of Daf Yomi. I knew that it was an international program to learn the entire Babylonian Talmud in 7.5 years at the rate of 1 page a day. But 7.5 years? My marriage had just fallen apart. I was in no place to make commitments. I wouldn't even sign a rental agreement for more than 6 months. Not to mention that I couldn't imagine studying all that Talmud at that point in my life. I studied some Talmud before. I went to a Salmon Schechter school through the 8th grade. I thought of the Talmud as a dry legal code with a complicated, convoluted logic. I was put off by what I perceived to be the rabbi's misogyny. Most of the women in the Talmud are either some rabbi's wife or daughter. Very few have independent identities. And then there's the sheer massiveness of the text. The Talmud Bavli is composed of some 2,700 pages, divided into 37 volumes, tractates, Masechtot. These Masechtot are further subdivided into chapters. And as I'm thinking about all this, my friend stopped me and she said something I never forgot. She said, Ilana, you're feeling completely stuck right now. Don't you think that maybe if every day you learned 1 page of Talmud, eventually a new chapter would have to begin? And I thought about that. I thought, if every day I learned 1 page of Talmud, then with every passing day, I wouldn't just be 1 day older, I'd be 1 day wiser. This is, of course, the Jewish view of time. Chazal teach in Pirkei Avot, ben 5 lemikra, ben 10 lamishna, ben 15 letalmud. Age 5, one begins studying Bible. At age 10, one begins studying Mishnah. At age 15, one begins studying Talmud. At that point, I was nearly twice the age stipulated in Pirkei Avot for studying Talmud. But as we learn elsewhere in Pirkei Avot, im lo achshav imatai. So I figured that maybe I would just give it a try and see if perhaps the Daf Yomi cycle might pull me forwards like a treadmill. Early in my learning, I came upon a story about an encounter between a wise sage, Rabbi Yehoshua, and the daughter of the Roman emperor. Rabbi Yehoshua was a great Torah scholar, but he was also a very ugly man. And the daughter of the Roman emperor took one look at him and said, how can such beautiful wisdom be contained in so ugly a vessel? Rabbi Yehoshua, the ugly vessel for beautiful Torah, came back at her with a question of his own. Does your father, the emperor, store his wine in clay vessels? Of course, she said, doesn't everyone? But he's the emperor, said Rabbi Yehoshua. Shouldn't he store his wine in the finest gold vessels? She acknowledged that he had a point, and she transferred all her father's wine to gold vessels, where immediately it spoiled. This story speaks to the relationship between who we are and what we learn. All of us are vessels for the Torah we study, and the Torah we study fills us and assumes our shape, much as wine and all liquids take the shape of their container. And there's a chemical reaction that takes place between who we are and what we learn. We are transformed by the Torah we study, and the Torah we study is transformed by our encounter with it. As I increasingly made myself into a vessel for Torah, I was surprised by what I discovered about the Talmud. Unlike later works that followed from it, the Talmud is not a law code that tells Jews how to behave, but a record of rabbinic conversations in which many of the questions are left open and unresolved. The Talmud is not a book for those searching for answers. It's a book for those living the questions, as I was at that very uncertain time in my life. And unlike the Talmud I studied in my Jewish junior high school, where we were presented with quoted passages of Talmud cut and pasted onto source sheets, studying Talmud in context, page after page, was a completely different experience. As an editor preoccupied with questions of structure and literary coherence, I was fascinated by how the rabbinic stream of consciousness flows from one subject to the next, proceeding by association rather than by any rational scheme. I followed along as the text meandered from a discussion about how we mark time to the dating of legal documents to the map of the stars in the night sky on the eve of Noah's flood, all in the opening pages of Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Sure, there were topics I found less interesting than others, but there was something that caught my eye on nearly every page. A folk remedy employed to heal an ailing sage, a rude insult leveled at one rabbi by another, or a sudden interjection from a rabbi's angry wife. I found myself carried along for the ride, listening in among the conversations, and tossed about like a rough wave when the rabbinic arguments became particularly stormy. And the Talmud also surprised me because, unlike the dry legal text I'd imagined it to be, the Talmud proved surprisingly romantic, even in the most legalistic context. And I thought maybe I'd illustrate this by drawing on an example from this week's Parsha, Chayei Sarah, which begins with Abraham's purchase of a plot of land in which to bury Sarah. Dr. Lee mentioned to me that the students in her class have been studying about loss. And of course, Chayei Sarah begins with profound loss, with the loss of Abraham's beloved wife Sarah, whom Abraham weeps over and eulogizes in the opening verses of the Parsha, Vayavo Abraham lispod l'Sarah v'litkotah. This is then followed by Abraham's efforts to purchase a plot of land in which to bury Sarah. At first, the Hittim, who are in charge of the fields of Ephron, where Abraham wishes to bury Sarah, offer just to give him the land for free. And indeed, we might think that Abraham would take them up on the offer. After all, God has just promised him the whole land of Canaan for himself and his descendants. But in spite of the divine promise, Abraham insists on a financial transaction that is fair and square, and he buys the land at full price for 400 shekel coins. This seems to be merely a dry account of an economic exchange, but when we dig deeper and look beneath the surface, this is, after all, a story about burial, we see that for the rabbis of the Talmud, the burial of Sarah becomes the basis for several foundational discussions about marriage, ownership, and eternal love, what it means for our love to outlive us. In the first chapter of Masechet Kiddushin, this is source 2 on your source sheet, the tractate of the Talmud that deals with betrothal, how a man betroths a woman in marriage, the rabbis draw explicitly on the story of Sarah's burial. On the opening page, they famously state that a woman may be betrothed in any one of 3 ways, with money, with a document, and by means of sexual intercourse. The rabbis explain that the way we know that a woman may be betrothed by means of money is because of the story of Abraham's burial of Sarah. Just as the Torah uses the term kicha, kach, taking, to describe how a man marries a woman, ki yikach ish isha uva eleha, so too does the Torah use this term to describe Abraham's purchase of a burial plot, natata kesef hasadeh kach mimeni. And since we know that Abraham purchased the land with money, or bamot shekel kesef, the rabbis conclude, we also know that a woman may be betrothed by means of money. The notion of a woman being acquired by money, as if the woman is an object that can be owned, is antithetical, if not outrageous, to our modern sensibilities. But as the analogy to Abraham's purchase of a burial plot suggests, a woman is actually not like a commodity that can be transferred freely from one person to another, but rather like land, which is something else entirely. Throughout the Talmud, the rabbis distinguish between metaltalin and karka, between movable property and land. Movable property, like a refrigerator or a bicycle, can be owned, but land inevitably outlives its owner. As we know from the Shemitah laws, ki li kol ha'aretz, the only person who truly owns the land is God, and we humans are merely temporary custodians put on this earth to work it and to safeguard it. Land may belong to someone just as one spouse may belong to another, but land, like a person, can never be truly owned. And while the analogy between betrothal and burial may still seem unromantic, we have to remember that it's not just any land that Abraham is buying, it's land in Canaan, in the land that God has promised him, the beloved homeland of the Jewish people. Abraham's love for Sarah becomes a metaphor for the Jewish people's love for the land of Israel and vice versa. After all, when Sarah died, Abraham wept profoundly over her loss, as we learn at the beginning of the Parsha, Vayavo Abraham Lifkod Sarah V'Lifkotah. The cave in which Sarah is buried becomes the setting for an unusual Talmudic story in Baba Batra, source 3, about a sage named Rabbi Bina'ah, whose job it is to mark burial sites so that people do not inadvertently step over them and contract impurity. One day, Rabbi Bina'ah, in going about his daily business, comes to Me'at HaMachpelah, the cave where Abraham and Sarah are buried, and he discovers that Abraham is lying between Sarah's arms, and she is caressing his head. What better expression of the beautiful line in Shir HaShirim, Ki azach hamavet ahava, that love is as fierce as death. No wonder it was so important for Abraham to find a suitable burial place for his wife. It was the place where they would continue to lie together for generations to come. Like Abraham, who came into possession of the land of Israel while grieving Sarah, I came to Talmud study while I was grieving. I was mourning the loss of my marriage, mourning the direction I thought my life was going in, mourning the person I thought I was becoming. But that mourning gave way to other joys, as the laws of betrothal underlie the law, as the laws of burial underlie the laws of betrothal in the opening chapter of Masechet Kiddushin. We see a similar shift even in our parasha. Kvura, burial, is an anagram of Rivka's name. The same 4 letters, Kuf, Vet, Resh, and He, are used in both. The parsha progresses from a story of Kvura to the narrative of Rivka. It is the quest for Rivka, the quest for a wife for Abraham's son Yitzchak, that dominates the second half of Parshat Chayei Sarah, as burial leads here too to betrothal. And then in next week's Parsha, Toldot, we find another scrambling of the anagram. Kvura, which became Rivka, now becomes Kirba, that internal space where the babies struggle in Rivka's womb. Vayitrotitzu habanim b'kirba. My own life, over the course of my Daf Yomi study, followed a similar trajectory. When I began learning, it was a very solitary pursuit. I would listen to podcasts, I downloaded off the internet, alone in my studio apartment, following along in a volume of Talmud I borrowed from a neighbor. The nice thing about living in Yerushalayim is that there's a good chance that one of your neighbors owns a full set of shots, and if they're not learning Daf Yomi, they'll lend you that Masechet. The rabbis teach in Masechet Eruvin, source 4, Hamahalech baderech ve'enimo levaya ya'asok b'Torah. If one is walking along his way and has no companion, he should occupy himself with Torah. And so that's what I did. Daf Yomi was my companion during what was otherwise a very lonely stretch of life. But as I soon realized, Daf Yomi is never really a solitary pursuit, because tens of thousands of individuals learn Daf Yomi worldwide, and they're all quite literally on the same page, following a schedule fixed in 1923 in Poland by Rabbi Meir Shapiro, the founder of Daf Yomi. And so Daf Yomi is essentially the world's largest book club. And even when I was alone at home listening to podcasts, I was really actually inhabiting an enormous virtual classroom in which sitting ahead of me were rows and rows of scholars who studied that text in generations before me. And further along in the row where I was sitting were other students of Talmud elsewhere in Yerushalayim, in Bnei Brak, in London, in Manhattan, in Muncie, and everywhere in the world, there are people of the book. When I realized this, that I was inhabiting this virtual classroom, I thought, well, I'm living in Yerushalayim, the capital of Jewish learning. Why don't I join a real Daf Yomi class? And so I did. I began attending a class that met at a local shul. I was the only woman in the class, and I brought down the average age by about 30 years. But the rabbi welcomed me with a warm smile and a twinkle in his eye, and soon I became one of the guys. And so slowly, my community began to form around Daf Yomi. As I paged my way through the Talmud, I discovered something interesting about Jewish learning. The more you learn and the more you know, the more you realize how much yet you have to learn and how much more you want to know. And so that Daf Yomi class led me to start attending a class on the weekly Parsha taught by Avida Zornberg. And in that class, I met the man I went on to marry in 2009, and he started learning Daf Yomi too. And while we were dating, we would learn together, often over dinner in one of our apartments, careful not to drip tomato sauce from our pasta, and discussions about the sprinkling of blood on the meat. We got married within a year, and we had 4 children over the next 5 years. And through it all, we kept learning, even though life was hectic. One of us would read aloud from that day's page of Talmud while the other would wash dishes or fold laundry. After our children were born, I would come to the end of my learning, not at the bottom of the page, but whenever a baby woke up. The pages from those months are filled with sudden splash marks whenever I was interrupted. Then I would pick up later in bed, falling asleep with the rabbi still arguing in my head about how late one can recite the bedtime Shema. And so I followed the Talmud, but the Talmud also followed me through the various twists and turns my life took. Divorce, dating, aliyah, marriage, pregnancy, and motherhood, all of which unfolded against the backdrop of my daily Talmud study. C.S. Eliot famously wrote in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, "I have measured out my life in coffee spoons." Well, I have measured out my life in Masechtot. I remember periods in my 20s and 30s based on what I was learning in Daf Yomi at the time, and I associate Talmudic passages with what was going on in my life when I learned them. For example, 4 years ago, I gave birth to twins. And this is where we return to the Kirba part of my Ura, Rivka, Kirba sequence. Like Rivka, I also had 2 babies struggling within me, and I could detect 2 distinct patterns of fetal movement. The baby on top gave sudden jolting kicks as if leveling a blow at an imaginary opponent. The one at the bottom didn't so much kick as undulate, fluttering around in a gentle rhythmic dance. Throughout my pregnancy, I jokingly referred to them as Yaakov and Esav, and you can imagine my relief when they were both girls. They were born right at the beginning of Masechet Shabbat, and I remember that because shortly after I returned home from the hospital, I came to the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived during a time of Roman persecution when it was forbidden to study Torah. This is source 5 on your source sheet. If you don't, I'll never continue. Rabbi Shimon flees with his son to the Beit Midrash, where they study Torah in secret. Only Rabbi Shimon's wife knows where they are. But soon, Rabbi Shimon begins to worry that maybe his wife will betray them. After all, as he tells his son, Nashim da'atan kala alehem. Women are lightheaded and easily swayed. So instead, he takes his son and they flee to a cave where for 12 years they study Torah together. Now, there are several strange and puzzling elements to the story. When Rabbi Shimon and his son are in the cave, they shed all their clothes and sit there buried up to their necks in sand like talking heads. A miracle occurs. God creates a carob tree and a spring of water that supply all their nutritional needs. And when at the end of 12 years they emerge from the cave, the outside world is bright and blinding. And they see people running to and fro, going about their daily business. And they think, what could they possibly be doing? What could be so important? Ultimately, they return back to the cave for another year. And Rabbi Shimon says to his son, Dai la'olam ani ve'ata. The world is enough with me and with you. I first came across the story early in my maternity leave when I was holed up at home with my newborn twins. It was the dead of winter, so I rarely left the house, nor did I bother to get dressed in the morning. I just wore the same sweatpants day after day. I was essentially buried up to my neck in sand. My life consisted of an endless cycle of breastfeeding one girl, breastfeeding the other, changing one diaper, changing the other, and of course, all the while, trying to keep up with Daf Yomi. I was the carob tree and the spring of water and the study partner all rolled up into one. On those rare occasions when I did manage to bundle up the girls in their snugglies and head out with my double stroller, I too felt like the harsh light of day was bewildering and blinding. I would see people running to catch a bus or get to work on time, and I would think to myself, what are they doing? What could possibly be so important? And then I would come back home and I would unbundle the girls and I would look at them and sigh in weary elation, and I would quote those same words that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai spoke to his son, Dai la'olam ani ve'ata. Now, I know this story is often read as an instance of rabbinic misogyny. After all, the whole reason that Rabbi Shimon and his son flee to the cave is because Rabbi Shimon worries that Nashim da'atan kala aleihen, like may betray him. This becomes even more pronounced when we consider the story in its halachic context. In the second chapter of Masechet Shabbat, Bamemad-Likin, sandwiched between the Mishnah about the 3 sins for which women die in childbirth, and the Mishnah about what a husband must remind his wife to do in her Shabbat preparations, as if this entire section of Talmud is overshadowed by a fear of women's sinfulness and flightiness. But when I read the story, I don't identify with Rabbi Shimon's light-headed wife. I identify with Rabbi Shimon, engaged in an active, intimate Torah study with his son. And indeed, the more I learn, the more it becomes clear to me that by the Talmud standards, I am a man and not a woman. If man is defined as an independent, self-sufficient adult, whereas woman is a dependent, generally living in either her father's or her husband's home. In some ways, this is a relief, because I can regard the Talmud's gender stereotypes as historical curiosities rather than infuriating provocations. The Talmud does not offend me because I am defying its classifications through my very engagement with the text. So many of the classical interpretations of Talmud reflect gendered assumptions, and these texts have the potential to take on radically new meaning when read through feminine eyes. Take the cave of Bar Yochai, traditionally regarded as a sort of kollel in the cave, where Bar Yochai and his son hide away and immerse themselves wholly in their learning, devoid of worldly concerns. Bar Yochai privileges the devotional over the political. He studies as a way of retreating from the world and disdains what he calls chayei sha'ah, the life of this world. But I use my learning about Bar Yochai's cave, and so much of my learning, to shed light on my experiences outside the Beit Midrash. Bar Yochai's cave afforded me with a metaphor for my maternity leave, for that ultimate closeness between mother and child, almost like a womb. And indeed, the same Talmudic term, kever, is used to refer to both tomb and womb. Like Bar Yochai, buried in the cave, the fetus in the womb, as we know from source 6, is removed from the outside world and sits there naked without having to worry about sustenance. This is provided by the mother, just as God provides for Bar Yochai, as the Talmud teaches in Midah. What does a fetus resemble in its mother's womb? A folded notebook, and a candle burns for him above his head. And the Umelamdinoto kol haTorah kula. And so the Kfura of Machpelah, where Abraham buried Sarah, gives way to the romance represented by Rivka, which is also the romance of Abraham and Sarah embracing in the cave visited by Rabbi Bina'ah. And Rivka gives way to Kirba, that interior space of the womb, and the burial cave, where the child imbibes all the parents' Torah. As with my encounter with each of these cave narratives, my own story seemed to follow the Talmud, and all too often I found myself in its pages. As a wife and mother of young children, I discovered that Talmudic passages that had nothing to do with motherhood or parenting took on a whole new meaning when read amidst the din of life with 3 rowdy toddlers. When one of my twin daughters got her first teeth a few months before her sister and began biting her again and again, leaving her poor sister without recourse, I thought of the biblical concept of a shorm lad, an ox which is known to have gored at least 3 times, and which Chazal used to refer to the first of 4 general categories of damages. When my son lost his beloved stuffed elephant, and we bought him a replacement one, only to discover that the original elephant had been located by his teacher and restored to his drawer in his preschool classroom, I came to a new understanding of the concept of korban tzmura, whereby one animal designated for sacrificial purposes is replaced by another. And as I emptied the dishwasher early in the morning so that I could have breakfast ready for my kids before they woke, I thought about Trumat Hadeshen, the first ritual performed in the temple each morning, which involved clearing away the ashes from the previous day's sacrifice, an act which, like emptying the dishwasher in the early morning, links the previous day with the one that is dawning. I imagine the activities I perform each day for my children as my korban tamid, the daily sacrifice offered every morning in the temple. I write about many of these analogies and metaphors in my book, and in a way, my book is a recounting of my life set against the backdrop of the daf, but that's not exactly accurate, because I never really set out to write a memoir. I wrote the material that became this book initially for myself as my ongoing commentary on the Talmud as I was learning. I filled the margins of my volumes of Talmud with notes, and when I had more to say than could fit in the margins, I began writing journal entries and blog posts, which I published on an anonymous blog. I never dreamed that this material would be published, and so I suppose that in the early drafts, I was more open and more bold. It was 4 years ago that I first began thinking about collecting all of this material into a book. By that point, the notes I had taken and the essays I'd written had already become so much a part of how I understood the Talmudic text that I could not possibly omit them from my book. I shared details about my life in spite of myself, because I felt either that they illuminated the text or made an argument for a way of reading the text, in which the text is a commentary on life, and life is a commentary on the text. This way of reading required a certain degree of exposure, and this was not easy. I am very reluctant to share aspects of my private life with others. The rabbis of the Talmud speak of the notion of hezek re'iyah, the notion that being seen can constitute a form of damage. For me, this has always felt very real. I grew up as a rabbi's daughter, and we were taught the value of privacy from a very young age. We were always supposed to say when a congregant called, Abba can't come to the phone right now, and not Abba's at the supermarket, or Abba's at the cemetery, or Abba's at a wedding that you weren't invited to. I internalized the value of privacy from an early age, and perhaps that's part of the reason that there's a lot I omitted from my book. There's a lot I left on the cutting room floor. I suppose that's something I have in common with the editors of the Talmud. They were always picking and choosing what they would draw from other sources, what they would quote. The same Talmudic stories appear in multiple contexts, often with different endings or different frame narratives or with entire sections left out. The rabbis will quote one braita, but not another. Indeed, the very concept of a braita is something outside a piece of text that did not make it into the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi. For Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi, compiling the Mishnah was a project of choosing what to include and what to exclude. It was a massive organizational feat. Much of this work was done by Rabbi Akiva, we're told, who was like a worker who goes out with his basket and puts in wheat, barley, spelt, and lentils, and then takes it all home to sort it out. For me too, writing this book involved a lot of sorting. I had pages of notes about my learning and hundreds of blog posts I'd written as I studied. I knew I didn't want to write a collection of essays because I work in book publishing and I know that doesn't sell. So not all of it was going to make it into the book. Those statements that did not make it into the Mishnah were compiled as the Tosefta. Let's just say that I hope no one ever publishes my job. So yes, it's a personal book, and it's a book that touches upon private matters. But that's true of how I feel about Talmud Torah as well. The Talmudic sage Rabbi Yossi says in Masechet Sotah, oh, it's not an inscription, sorry. Ein divrei Torah mikaymin ela b'misham amid atzmo arum aleihem. Words of Torah can only be fully learned by one who makes himself naked before them. Rabbi Yossi is commonly understood as suggesting that in order to learn Torah deeply and fully, you have to strip yourself of your preconceived notions. But I read it differently. To me, it seems that the most meaningful way to study Torah is by searching for the interconnections and resonances between Torah and the rest of one's reading, learning, and living. Torah cannot be studied in a vacuum, so I prefer to interpret Rabbi Yossi's statement as implying that to learn Torah, you have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable. You have to summon the courage to let the text resonate in the darkest recesses of your soul in the hope that your soul will illuminate the text and the text will illuminate your soul. I have bared much of my soul in my book, but I hope that doing so will inspire you to read your life into the text and to incorporate these texts into your life. There you go. My book then is a chronicle of my encounter with the text over 7.5 years. The title of the book, If All the Seas Were Ink, comes from a trope that appears throughout rabbinic literature. I first encountered it in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, which I learned with a friend in a cafe in Jerusalem, actually the same cafe that Erin mentioned, where she and I met in August. The cafe is known as Aroma, though we called it Cafe Amora, because we used to sit there every Tuesday afternoon and read Amoreic Midrash. The Midrash quotes Rabbi Eliezer. I think I put this on your sheet. Yeah. Im yu kol hayamim tio, va'agamim kol mosin, v'shamayim va'aretz megilot, v'chol b'nei ha'adam lavlarim, ein matkikin lichtov Torah shalamadati, va'ani lo chisartia ela ke'adam shematil dachuto k'mikol bayam. If all the seas were ink and all the reeds pens and the heaven and earth scrolls and all of mankind's scribes, they would not suffice the Torah to write the Torah which I have learned, and yet I have diminished it no more than a man would take by dipping the point of his painting stick into the sea. And then his teacher, his student, Rabbi Akiva, responds that he sees it a little differently. He has his own metaphor for his learning. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ani ein bi koach lomar kmo she'amru rabotai, ela rabotai chisruha, va'ani lo chisartia ela k'meiriach be'etrog. Ha'meiriach neheneh v'ha'etrog lo chaser, u'chememale me'amat hamayim, u'chemadlik miner l'ner. Rabbi Akiva says, it is not possible for me to say as my teacher said, and this is actually a great moment because Rabbi Akiva, in deference to his teacher, is saying, I can't even say that I learned as much as my teachers, right? I wasn't dipping I didn't even take out that much, as a painting stick would fill. And then he goes on to say something that's totally different, as if he's being humble, but in fact, he has a totally different metaphor. He says, learning Torah is not about diminishment, right? I have not taken any more than one who smells an etrog. He who smells enjoy it, while the etrog is not diminished. Or than one who fills his pitcher from an ongoing and flowing watercourse, or one who lights one lamp from another. These sources capture the infinite nature of Torah study. Torah is as vast as the sea, and each time we learn, we are taking in only as much as could fill a small vial dipped into a vast ocean. And yet, Torah is infinite. Infinity minus one is infinity. So when we study Torah, we do not diminish it. We are rather increasing and replenishing the beauty and light in the world. And yet it took me a long time to learn this lesson. When I first began sitting in on that all-male Daf Yomi class, I never opened my mouth. I thought, everyone around me has been learning Talmud for decades. What can I possibly have to contribute to the conversation? I'm reminded of a story in Masechet Chagiga about that same Rabbi Yehoshua, the ugly rabbi, who once sent 2 of his disciples to go learn in another rabbi's Beit Midrash. And when his students came back, he said to them, okay, what did you learn? What can you teach me? His students looked at him like he was crazy. Talmidecha anu umeimecha anu shotim. We are your students. We drink from your waters. Again, invoking that analogy between Torah and liquid. What can we possibly have to teach you that you don't already know? Rabbi Yehoshua looked at his students gravely and said, Ein Beit Midrash l'lo chidush. There can be no encounter with Torah that does not produce new Torah. Anytime you engage with a text of our tradition, you come up with new insights. You may think that because it's your first time reading a particular text or opening a volume of Talmud that you can't possibly have anything original to share. But as someone who teaches, I can say that it is often those who view the text through fresh eyes that make the most valuable contributions. No 2 people read the text in exactly the same way, and no one person reads the text in the same way at 2 different points in his or her life. There's always something to be discovered. And so encouraged by their teacher, Rabbi Yehoshua's students shared that they had learned the following teaching. You must make your ears into a funnel to receive Torah. You must make yourself receptive to Torah, so that Torah fills you, shapes you, and assumes your shape. When Rabbi Shimon heard this, he said to his students, Margalit tova hayta biyadchem ubikashtem la'ovda mimeni. You had this precious pearl of wisdom, and you sought to deprive me of it. Each of us has pearls of wisdom to share with others. Each of us can assume a seat that can be occupied by no one else in the communal enterprise of Talmud Torah, and each of us has a life that can enrich the text. Each of us has been given Morashat Kilat Yaakov, a vast, rich, and infinite textual heritage that can enrich our lives. It is an appreciation for the infinite nature of Torah study that has me now deep into my second cycle of Daf Yomi, and on Monday I finished Masechet Sanhedrin for the second time. This is a nod to a theme. The Masechet as a whole deals with the administration of justice in the Jewish state, and the second chapter focuses on the role of the king and the high priest. Amidst the laws about how a king must conduct himself, the Mishnah relates that he is obligated to write his own Sefer Torah. At this point, the 3rd century sage Rabbah comments, "Afal pi shehilichu lo avotav la'adam Sefer Torah, mitzvah lichtov lishalo." Even if one's ancestors have left him a Torah scroll, it's a mitzvah to write one for himself. Which is how I regard my project of writing my memoir. In this sense, I suppose I'm following in the footsteps of Betrothed, who the Torah teaches and Masechet Sanhedrin recounts, approached Moshe while Bnei Israel were in the Midbar to ask if they too might inherit a plot of land in Eretz Israel, since their father had died, leaving no sons to inherit him. God instructed Moshe that yes, Shlochad's 5 daughters should inherit their father's portion and have their own share in the land. The Midrash, in Sifrei Bamidbar, explains why God granted them this dispensation. Vatikravna b'not Shlochad, so it's 9. Kevan sheshamu b'not Shlochad sheha'aretz mitchaleket l'shvatim v'lo lenekevot nitkabtzu kulan zo al zo litol eitzah. Amru, lo kerachamei basar v'dam rachamei hamakom, basar v'dam rachamav al hatzcharim yoter min hanekevot. אבל מי שאמר והיה העולם אינו כן, אלא רחמיו על הזכרים ועל הנקבות, רחמיו על הכל, שנאמר טוב השם לכל, ורחמיו על כל מעשיו. When the daughters of Shlochad heard that the land was to be apportioned to the tribes and not to females, they gathered together to take counsel, saying, "Not as the mercies of flesh and blood or the mercies of God. The mercies of flesh and blood are greater for males than females. But the one who spoke the world into being, his mercies are for males and females, his mercies are for all, as it is written, Tov Hashem lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav." Human beings are not always equally compassionate to men and women, but God, who created both man and woman, is compassionate to all. And so Benot Shlochad found their place in the land of Israel. In Masechet Sanhedrin, we learned that actually Benot Shlochad did not just merit to inherit the land, they also merited to write the entire portion of the Torah that deals with the division of land in Israel. That is to say, women contributed to the writing of Torah, and thus women have been writing Torah for even longer than men have been studying it. I am excited to be among them and to regard the Talmud, though plowed through by generations of male scholars, as fertile ground for gleaning new insights. Now in my second cycle of Daf Yomi, I completed Sanhedrin for the second time on Monday, when completing a Masechet of Talmud, if not a book talk. It's customary to recite a prayer known as the Hadran. Hadran alach v'hadrach alam. Hadran comes from the word for return, and so the prayer means, may we return to you and may you return to us. That is to say, may we return to the text because inevitably we'll forget some of what we've learned. And may the text also return to us because we hope that some of what we learn will stay with us. This prayer gives voice to my fervent belief in the power of learning to make the world endlessly interesting. There's always more to learn, and so there's always a reason to get out of bed in the morning, even when life seems most bleak. But in classic Talmudic wordplay, hadran, from the word hadar, also means beauty and glory. So this prayer can also mean our beauty is from you and your beauty is from us, which conveys the notion that we, with our own individual life experiences and our own unique perspectives, can beautify the study of Talmud, and Talmud can beautify us. I hope I succeed in my book in sharing some of that beauty with you. So I'm happy if there are any questions. Sure. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for coming. I really love what you said about kind of finding your space as one of the men in the Talmudic conversation.
And for me, like, I grew up in a co-ed Orthodox school, and like that's absolutely what I was taught from a young age. Like, yes, like you're part of, like that. I don't know what was supposed to be said, but the assumption was like you're showing have their opinion and you have yours, and your job is to argue and be part of it and ask questions. And then last year, when me and the yeshiva were learning Torah Is Not, that kind of took a strong turn. It was like, oh, all of a sudden, I'm in a locker room where people, like, when they want to know what Egypt blood looks like, are like going to a bloodletter as opposed to like waiting a couple of weeks. And it suddenly felt like, oh, like I actually like this image of myself that was like very inside, all of a sudden like felt very outside for like a year's worth of stuff. And so I'm wondering, since you really, that was probably like half cycle ago, for you and Dr. Like, did that kind of study, did you still feel on the inside when you were learning about it?
I think it was when I read passages of Talmud that seemed alienating and off-putting that I felt most motivated to add my voice in. And I always say, like, every Masechah Gemara has that blank. It has the margins, right? That's why there are margins. And, our tradition is a cumulative tradition, and our tradition is so vibrant because everyone continues to add their notes in the margins. And so I would often disagree with the rabbis and add my voice into the conversation. Chazal thought themselves experts in women's analogy and physiology and psychology, and I think how wonderful that we can, add our own voices in. And I think some of that, some of it, I was trained as a historian of science. That was sort of a grand way of saying what I did my BA in, but not really a historian of science. But anyway, I've come to appreciate how subjective our own ideas of what is scientifically accurate are, how historically contextualized they always are. And so I also have the humility to say, well, this is not how I see it now, and I'm going to say how I see it, but I'm also well aware that, God willing, in another century when people are still learning Daf Yomi, they may see it differently, and we're all part of this ongoing conversation.
I'm a member of the graduating class 1954 of Yeshiva University High School for Boys. 3 years ago, on the occasion of our 60th anniversary of high school graduation, we had a reunion at which, surprisingly, a rather large number of graduates were present. In a day of spiritual learning, the vast majority of my classmates voted Talmudic study their least favorite high school study. I was for 11 years an educational director in some of the finest Orthodox Jewish summer camps. I can testify as well that the study of Talmud in our yeshiva is one of the least popular subjects for these young people. Yet we devote the overwhelming majority of our hours to seeking to grow spiritually by Talmud study rather than textual study of, let us say, Rambam or Lahavdil or Chamalevitz, etc., etc. What advice can you give from your perspective that can turn on our young people, not in their 30s and 40s, to Talmud study, but to the potential of their 15 to 20, 25-year range when they seem to be so distant from the love and enthusiasm that you convey to us?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important in all aspects of Jewish education that texts be made deeply relevant to students. And I think there are many ways of doing that, and often it involves a creative approach to pedagogy, whether it's, I remember in junior high school, we used to act out plays about the Mishnah where I'd carry a pole and bump into my friend who was carrying a barrel or what have you, and we'd act out vignettes from Nizikin. And I think that's also sort of the charge of the whole Dor Vador Chayav Adam L'Rot Etzmo Ki'ilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim. We have to read ourselves into the dramas of our history and into the texts of our tradition. And there are many ways of doing that. Why can't someone have, as a homework assignment, to write a creative essay about how it feels to be the Kohen Gadol alone in the Kodesh Kodeshim on Yom Kippur, as they're learning Masechet Yoma, for example, right? If you are given assignments where you imagine yourself into the text, you think the text has your meaning.
May I just one follow-up? One approach that's being spoken of is the study of Gemara of Talmud in a manner that seems to be away from your approach, which is study the entire text. Don't take parts of the text out of its full context, but begin at point A and go to point Z. Is there any merit in choosing and selecting sugyot, sections, statements, utilizing them as the bridge to learning until one comes to the age of maturity and insight which you have brought to us?
So, look, I think on the one hand, I'm sort of a textual purist, and I think there's a lot of value in reading text in context. And for me, what I most enjoy about Daf Yomi is that there's nothing as exciting as the next page of the Gemara, because you never know what you're going to find. And for me, at least, I can't casually go into the Daf and guess who I'm going to find there, whether it's going to be Eliyahu Hanavi, who's suddenly going to come down from Shamayim onto the Daf, or something else entirely. And for me, that's part of the thrill of going through the Gemara page by page. And yet, on the other hand, learning Torah on a source sheet where someone else cuts and pastes sources and selects them for you, it's sort of like the way the Gemara is written, right? That's the notion of like Urminhu, right? If you're juxtaposing text, that's what Chazal are always doing. That is the engine of the Shakla V'Tarya of the Gemara. So I can't, tell you about learning on source sheets is inappropriate, but I think that, at different stages of life and in different educational contexts, different ways of learning have value. So I say anything that gets people engaged with text is a good thing, and there are many ways of doing it. Yeah. I will say that I think, I think.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was that, you want to repeat it, Father?
Yeah.
So the focus of education for girls is much more on Tanakh, and for boys is much more on Gemara, and as a result, there are lacunae in everyone's learning. Whatever. Yes. Anyway, so I would say that something I have come to appreciate through learning Daf Yomi is that Chazal knew by heart all of Tanakh, and when they're quoting a pasuk, they're often not quoting the words from or they're often not explicitly referring to the words from the pasuk they're quoting. They're referring to something that came earlier in the pasuk or later in the pasuk, or even two pasukim before. And you have to fully appreciate, right? You're seeing, when you see the words quoted from pasuk, you're seeing like the tip of an iceberg, and you have to open the Tanakh and view the whole iceberg if you want to have any understanding of what's happening in that sugya. Which is to say, so Chazal knew a lot of Tanakh, and Chazal also, right, the Tanaim were essentially walking books who walked around, having, memorized vast tracts of text that they could recite on demand. And I'm a big believer in the power of memorization, and I love memorizing text. I try to do it. And I try to instill in my kids the value of memorization, and I do that by singing to them. So I think that when you sing, you remember a lot more, and that's also why I absolutely love to lane, because when I see psukim, I basically know all the parts of the Tanakh that we lane. And yeah, but we don't lane it for them. Anyway, so that's very important for me in teaching my children. But anyway, my point being that I think Jewish learning is cumulative, and you can't really learn Gemara until you know the Mishnah that the Gemara is commenting on pretty much by heart if you want to truly learn well. On this cycle, I'm doing something different after years of carrying my Gemara with me everywhere I went. If I hadn't, I would learn first thing in the morning, and if I hadn't learned, then ever self-flagellating, I would carry my volume of Gemara with me everywhere I went. to remind myself that I still had to learn before I went to bed that night, and with certain masachtot like Baba Batra, rather cumbersome. but the truth is that's kind of impossible when you're also carrying diapers and wipes and 4 water bottles, everything else I carry around with me everywhere I go. So on this cycle, I've decided that I'm going to carry around paperback Mishnayot instead. And whenever I have spare time, instead of pulling out my heavy Gemara, I'm just going to make sure I really know well all the Mishnayot in the parak I'm learning in Daf Yomi. And this has proven very, very valuable because I know that I am very drawn to Agadah, and that's often, almost always, what I focus on when I'm learning. And it's really important also to pay attention to the halachic context in which all these Agadot appear. And in fact, that's part of what I most love about studying the Bavli specifically, is that the Bavli is full of Agadot, much more so than the Yerushalmi, because most of the Agadot of Eretz Yisrael were put in Rishon Rabba, Vayikra Rabba, and not in, in the Babel, they didn't have a Midrashic collection, of the Amoraic period. So I'm very, for me, it serves as a very powerful grounding, rooting myself in Mishnayot, and it does make me realize how important having that foundation is. Actually in the source from Sanhedrin that I brought you. I didn't bring the whole source, I just brought one line, but in talking about the king, and the king actually has to write 2 Sefer Torah. Chazal say 1 Sefer Torah that he carries with him wherever he goes, and 1 Sefer Torah that stays in his treasury. And Chazal go on to say, okay, so there's 1 Sefer Torah he carries with him, and that's a very small Sefer Torah. They say it's a kanea, like an amulet, and it goes with him everywhere. And then they say, but what does he do when he goes to the bathroom, And I really identify with the source, because for me, my kamea is my iPhone, which has always this Filled with Daf Yomi podcast, and I listen everywhere I go. And I will not tell you about what I do. but yeah, anyway, the point being that, and for me, that was a very natural question, by the way. What do you do when you go to the bathroom? Because that's right, I'm always listening to Daf Yomi. It's like the soundtrack for my life. And sometimes you have to turn it off, but it's hard. Anyway, so yeah.
I've sort of cheated because I've read through your wonderful book. And one of the things that I think didn't come through today as well in your talk is your rich background in world literature, and how you constantly refer to it and how it enriches your understanding of Talmudic text.
Yeah, when I'm learning Gemara, I always, or very often, hear echoes of other literature that I've studied and that I love. So I'll be learning about David, who learned that he was going to die on Shabbat, so he didn't want the Malach HaMavet to snatch his soul, and he knew that if he kept learning, as long as he was learning Torah, Malach HaMavet would not be able to get him. So he would spend every Shabbat learning Torah, so as to avoid, the Malach HaMavet snatching his soul. And when I came to this verse, I just wrote in the margins of my Gemara, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, because that for me was like, oh, Chazal are quoting Emily Dickinson, or Emily Dickinson is quoting Chazal. Or I would come to the story about the cure for leprosy. It's in Masachet Tubot Ayin Zayin, about, I know that because I mentioned it. Anyway, never mind. Okay, so I don't even think I can just reference everything. But anyway, but in Tubot Ayin Zayin, there's a story of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who would sit among the lepers and study Torah. I actually write about it in my book. But it's preceded by this sort of explanation of what you do if someone has Ratan, which is sort of leprous skin disease. And I read this, you have to take the tooth of some beast and the nail of this. And I read this and I said, oh, this is where Shakespeare got the cauldron scene in Macbeth. Right, so I was always hearing those echoes. I think also that it's not just that the Talmud resonates with other poems that I've read. I think it's more that there is something about the genre of poetry and the genre of Mishnah. Both are very concise. They're written in tight literary units in which no detail is extraneous and meaning is rarely transparent. So you have to do a lot of unpacking. And when I teach Mishnah, I often write it out like a poem with line breaks, because I think it's much easier to follow the logic when you have it broken up like that. And I also hear poetry, and by the way, and also Agadah, very, very concise, right? Okay, yes. So anyway, and also I think there's sometimes meter in the Gemara. I one point had this theory that I have not really fully pursued, but that I had this theory that every time a halachic sugya quotes a person speaking, it's in meter. I found a few examples, Oh, yes, in Masechet Sukkah, right. Anan shluchei mitzvah, anan ufturim min hatzukah. Perfect I am. And that would happen a few times. I'd feel like, wow, Chazal were writing in I am. That's really cool. But it would happen only in spoken speech. So anyway, I would hear poetry in what I was learning, and I also wrote poetry about the Gemara. There's only a little bit of it in the book, maybe one or two poems, because I wanted people to actually buy the book. But I wrote. I have a project of trying to write a lyric or a sonnet for every daf of the Gemara, and they're all on my blog.
Oh my God.
But yes, and that for me, by the way, was more of a mnemonic, really, just because I remember a lot of poetry. I think poetry is a good way of remembering when something is in rhyme with meter. So I write a lot of poems as a way of remembering what I'm. Yeah.
First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed everything you've done. May I suggest that you allow yourself to stop so that those of us who want to purchase a book can come out and do it. I need to run home. I wouldn't want you to miss that.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, and then we will have a review time for Ilana to sell and sign books.
Sure. To let anybody know that Dr. know there was a great Naomi show going on right in this building. Everybody should come and watch this. Very good.
You shared a little bit about what that is. You're going to the cycle again, but I want to hear more. What's next?
Well, I'll say that part of what's been really exciting about doing Daf Yomi for the second time is that I have, not only do I often, of course, not always, and maybe I should say sometimes, remember having learned that daf before, and I'll remember where I was when I learned it, and I'll have associations with where I was jogging when I was listening to that particular daf, or wherever I was. But also it will connect me back to where I was in my life at that time, and I've been increasingly just really more for myself, because it does seem quite like navel gazing as if writing a memoir weren't that already. But I've been writing about that experience of sort of having these memories. So my husband and I just celebrated our Daf Yomi anniversary. Anyway, so we learned the Daf Yomi at our wedding, and that was very meaningful. And yes, I've been reflecting on that, and I've been thinking a lot about, when I wrote this book, which I never really set out to write as a book, as I said, I never really realized that it would be something novel to people to integrate one's learning into all the other aspects of one's life. To me, as a very interdisciplinary thinker, that was just the obvious way that you learned everything. You connected what you learned so that it would become embedded in your mind and you would remember it. And increasingly, as I see that this seems to be like novel for people, I've tried to champion it in a way, because I didn't really see a need to do that before, but seeing how both people who have been learning the daf for far longer than I have, and people who have never felt any desire to pick up a volume of Talmud, have had the exact same response, which is, I never think to connect that my learning could be relevant to my life, has really inspired me to try to find ways to advocate for that and to model that, and to provide opportunities for that way of thinking.
So I've always known you to be a bibliophile, and clearly on display. So I wonder if you can comment about the specific experience of living your life against the backdrop of the Talmud, as opposed to the thousands of other books that you no doubt also live inside of.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I say in the book that I've spent my whole life reading books, but the Talmud is the one book I could imagine spending my whole life reading. In a way, I think of my book as belonging to a genre that I read a book review, it was a New York Times book review. Joyce Carol Oates reviewed the book a couple of years ago. The book was called My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead, and she referred to, if any of you read it, she referred to the book as a biblio-memoir, and she said she had coined this term, and it was a term for a memoir through a text. And I realized, oh, that's what I do. I write biblio-memoir, and my book is the Gemara. I think with the Gemara, it's just so rich and so suggestive that it's almost cheating to write a biblio memoir through the Gemara because, you know, you find everything in it. So, you know, you're searching for connections, you'll find the connections. But I love feeling like I'm always thinking in the language of the Gemara. I'm always quoting the Gemara, like even in ways that don't even make sense, like, you know, that are just silly, but I'll hear like an echo of something I'm saying. Like I'll open a bag of potato chips for my kids and put it on the floor because they're fighting over it. And I'll say, everyone can just come and take. And I'll say, Keter Torah Monachat Lifnechem, Kolar would say Avot, which doesn't really make sense, but in the same way that Torah, you know, like in my head, that's what I'm hearing when I say, everyone go take potato chips. So for me, it's very meaningful to live my life where that's what's always running through my head. I couldn't imagine, you know, there are other literatures that I love. I love Wordsworth and I love Coleridge. And I know a lot of Wordsworth and Coleridge by heart. And often lines from Wordsworth and Coleridge do pop into my head and they seem relevant, like, oh, you know, like the Gemara is my life and food for future years or whatever. But it's not, there's not the same rich level of resonance that I find with the Gemara because the texture is just so rich. And I don't know any other literature that is quite like that.
Thank you so much, Ilana, and to all of you for being here. There'll be a book signing outside now at the table. Thank you.